Hey guys, this is miicrow here. I thought I would give my thoughts on Season 4, the patch, where the game is going to move to, kind of the state of the game right now, and kind of go through all that high-level overview in this video and get into the details for some specifics and some future videos, and try to keep this a little bit higher level. So, like, right now, the game's in a very weird spot where there's a very big disparity between heavy and light, and there's basically no reason to go medium whatsoever. Heavy is dealing about the same damage as light with not like much drawback, if that makes sense. Heavy is about 40% more tanky than light and is dealing about 10 to 15% less damage. When you look at medium, medium just feels worse than heavy. With the new dodge change, there's no real benefit to going medium. The only classes that are still going medium in the game right now are Bruiser for a tiny bit more damage, for the for in turn for a decrease in survivability, and I think there's like maybe one other class that I'm not thinking of right now, but basically no one is going medium from like a war perspective, which I would consider war to be more optimized than OPR in terms of like where the meta is at. But OPR still very very light heavy. Like you see a lot of light players within OPR. You see a decent amount of heavy players within OPR, but again, you don't see many mediums, and medium is just not really being played in many modes right now. It felt like before I think before the change even occurred, people just didn't realize how good heavy was at the time. And with the dodge change, the stam change, medium just feels clumsy now compared to where it once was. It's just not in a great spot. And this patch, I don't think is going to change that too much. There's just more effects that effectively make heavy have less damage difference between heavy and light, heavy and medium, and there's not really any benefit coming to light to mitigate this, except for a few movement specific things that will be really interesting to look at. So starting off here with what is going to be coming for this expansion at a high level, well, expansion, it's the new season. We're going to get a new dungeon. There's going to be 8 new artifacts. These are like 8 artifacts that have not been released for various pieces. Like there wasn't a round shield artifact before. Now there will be a round shield artifact. I made a different video talking about the artifacts and where I'd rate them, but in general, I think most of the artifacts are going to be hyped up a lot, but have relatively low impact on the meta. I would be very surprised for some of these artifacts to have a higher impact on the meta, but I'm going to get that into a little bit more depth. The Winter Convergence Festival itself, there is a new dungeon. That dungeon will drop relatively good loot. It's there. It is dropping specifically elemental aversion and elemental or enchanted ward gear, which is really good for healers that are running featherweight, basically. Other than that, it's not as good for other classes. A lot of people are like, oh my gosh, this gear is best for my build. Well, you can just farm depths right now and you can get Shirking Fort Elemental Aversion, which is just better than Enchanted Ward for most builds. But for healers in particular, that gear tends to be really good. If you're a light player, that gear in general is just really good. But you need to have the Magnify to make up for it. So if you're a healer, that gear has Magnify, right? So you're going to have to run 300, 300, which most healers don't really like to run right now. I believe EU, which I'll do in yellow here, is doing 250 focus, 350 con. And then NA, which I'll do in blue here, is doing 350 focus, 250 con, which is kind of the other end of the spectrum. And you're going to have to meet in the middle there if you're going to run this gear, but it might be worth it because it does come with that illegal perk rule. And it is rumored that it's going to be upgradable at some point, albeit it was not upgradable on the OPR, which is really interesting. Uh, in terms of other features that are coming, it's basically just the dungeon and the event. The event is going to be giving away seals for event tokens, so those are basically free, and there's some other economy-related changes that we're going to get into when we're going through this. So in terms of the combat itself, which is what I want to focus on for the majority of this, in general, there's effects that were not affected by resistance perks before, and those will be affected. That would include like acid damage here. There's a change that's coming to bosses that did that because now there's a way to mitigate it. So it's like kind of a give and take there. So it should be relatively balanced compared to what it was once before. The Primal Fury is getting changed, albeit it's already kind of fallen off the meta from a PvP perspective. There was a brief moment where this Primal Fury ult was used basically by everyone because it was staggering, it was uninterruptible, and you can like chain the staggers, and you basically just couldn't do anything for it against it. You couldn't play the game. It feels like that doesn't really exist on live right now, but nevertheless, it made it into this patch note, so I'm a little confused why this is here. But Primal Fury is not very good right now. If there's like 10 people in an ult that would or 10 people that are in kill squad or whatever you want to call it, like the kind of more roamy group that tries to disrupt people, prevent healers from casting freely before. Originally, there was like 10 people using this ult. Now it's closer to like maybe 1 to 2 that are using this ult. It's not very strong anymore. People are going back to Vines, they're going back to Bile, they're going back to like other things to that just tend to get more value than that ult at the moment, which is kind of interesting. There are some blocking changes. I haven't really highlighted this a lot in the past. The main thing that it seems noteworthy from blocking is if you're getting hit from multiple attacks, this will be more effective. So if you're like a tank player in particular, blocking will be somewhat rewarded now. It will be a little bit less scary to block attacks rather than just having to turn your back and eat the actual damage to your health and then get healed from a healer and kind of have to play that weird game. You might be able to block more damage, which is nice. Seems like stamina in general with blocking is getting buffed across the board and is in a spot where I would definitely consider blocking if it doesn't feel awkward for certain things. So like one thing, for example, that I don't think a lot of people do very well that I see from some VODs from good players still, but it's like less than it used to be honest, is IG with Ice Gauntlet. You can block and it will take away mana and in turn give you stamina. That will be like very, very strong after this, and there's a few other related effects that just get buffed because of this, like Greatsword, for example. I believe from the PTR, from what we've seen, there are still weird interactions with how Kite Shield perks work, where if you have a Kite Shield, even if you don't actually use it, and you have the Empowering Block perk, you will effectively, if you block at all, you'll get a 30% in power. Doesn't even matter if you use that shield or not because it is implemented incorrectly, and that was just not caught. So there are some things there that are like kind of abusable that I hope get addressed in the near future, but for now it seems like blocking is moving in a direction that is going to make it more viable, but I wish it was like more fun, I guess. Like you have like games like For Honor, which has been out for a very long time, where it feels like blocking is like very core to how the gameplay works. Like you can attack, you can block, you can parry kind of thing. And versus New World, it's just like, hey, I held the right click button down and I don't take damage now. Or hey, I hit the shift button, I don't take damage now. Like I wish there was a little bit more to it, a little bit like higher skill gap. Like if you block, like you do a perfect block, maybe it doesn't take stamina, for example, or it takes less stamina. But that's not a thing in this game yet, and I'm like looking to see that at some point. But for now, I think it's moving in the right direction, and I'm like pretty happy with this. In terms of consumes, they fixed an interaction that basically made it so the artifact that gave you an Empower and a Fortify when you popped consume every 5 seconds, that is not abusable anymore with focus pots, which is good to know because I had to talk about that for a month or two, and I'm glad that's finally getting addressed. That was kind of king in 3v3 if you weren't aware. It's also really good for a lot of kill squad builds. A lot of people are kind of abusing this focus potion. Now people will just go back to Focus Potion being completely useless, which sucks for Focus Potion, but it is what it is. And we'll probably go back to using like Healthy Toast with Mana Pots or something like that. So in terms of artifacts, this is like the 4th time that they're saying they fixed Odo, and every single time they've said that they fixed Odo, it has not fixed Odo. So I'm very skeptical. I'm looking forward to testing this and seeing if Odo is actually fixed to be doing damage to stunned players for either weapon like that conditional. Was just not working before, so I'm happy that's getting addressed. Endless Thirst is that earring artifact I was talking about that was really, really strong in the past. It's going to be still strong, but it's not going to be as abusable as it was. That being said, with all Ankh nerfs that we'll get into in a second, I think this makes it a little bit better. Updated the Abyss, Life Taker, and Inferno tooltips to clarify on the conversion. For those of you who don't know, you can't put like an int conversion gem or like a focus conversion gem into these weapons, which makes them like kind of weird in some circumstances, but I was thinking of the Abyss and the Inferno. And there's also an interaction with Mjolnir that doesn't let that, so there's like weird combinations where it's like, hey, Mjolnir in theory does 99% lightning damage, 1% strike damage, which would be really good to put a int conversion gem into, because then you have pure lightning damage that you're scaling off of, but you can't actually do that. So there's like some weird interactions there that I don't think a lot of people know about, but it's just like quality of life stuff, basically. Bloodmaker, this one's kind of interesting. They're making Bloodbreaker give an increased effect to all lifesteal healing while it's active. So the thing that like influences this a lot is Flail, because Flail gives like a 10% lifesteal from the actual smite perk if you have enough focus and it's not being stripped. So that's something that like a lot of people I don't think have really thought about, that hey, you actually have a passive like 10% lifesteal in PvP right now if you play near a Flail. So that's going to be interesting to see how that interacts. In general, I don't think people are going to switch to Blood Drinker because they don't want to take the damage drop. but it is a good way to kind of have, if you're more utility class and you just want to stay alive, I don't think it's a bad option whatsoever. But at the end of the day, lifesteal in this game is not very effective because it's limited by the amount of people that you can hit, and you can't just basically full heal from doing an AoE effect, which makes like lifesteal like Blood Drinker like albeit good, but it's not gonna like save you in most circumstances. And at the end of the day, as much as like AGS devs are trying to make it so that you're not dependent on playing with a healer, you are dependent on playing with a healer in New World. If you're not playing with a healer in New World, you're fundamentally playing a different game that is not comparable to playing the game with the healer, and the experience with a healer is a lot better than the experience without a healer. And I think the role queue aspect of like needing to have a healer in a group when you do an OPR or something like that like would be more beneficial than like kind of going down a self-sustain route from like a medium to large scale a queue-based PvP area of the game, I guess. They fixed an issue with Life Taker did not trigger properly for all range attacks. I still think this is going to be bugged, most likely. Life Taker also just didn't seem to scale correctly in terms of damage. It's kind of weird. We're in a spot with artifacts where people are starting to realize that artifacts suck. So Scorpion Sting has gotten nerfed to the point where no one was running it after the first nerf, and it's got nerfed 2 times after that. And like no one's using that. No one's using Life Taker either. Like it's not usable right now. No one's using Odo because you can't put in a gem slot and you can't put in like Smite or like a weapon perk. You have to choose one or the other. There's like all these artifacts that like seem like they would be like really really cool, but they're not actually viable from a PvP perspective, and it's like more of a collector's item at the moment, which is both good and bad, but I think mostly bad. Because you would hope that these like really hard to obtain items would be like really influential and maybe not be like essential for the gameplay of the class, like how Magnetic Gauntlets, like you need that if you run a VG. But you would hope that it would be like a little bit more balanced, and it's just not. Based off the feedback from PTR, Unmoved Artifact will be basically, this is making it so that you're not going to get pulled by the Unmoved Artifact will make you get pulled by Scorpion Sting. So this is another nerf to the thing that's not being used right now. There's like in war like a while ago, but at this point, like maybe 4 weeks to a month, there were like maybe 5 Scorpion Stings used. At the moment, there is 1 to 0 per army. It's not very popular because of the cooldown increase, because of how it interacts with refreshing, because of how it interacts with cooldown reduction perks. Where with the refreshing cooldown reduction perks, there's the 50% increase. The actual cooldown itself is not being taken into consideration with refreshing or active cooldown reduction for some reason. So it's really really hard to use the Scorpion Sting a lot. It's like kind of a, hey, you hit this and it's really really cool and really really powerful in theory, but it doesn't seem to be as consistent as people think. I think there's a bit of an overreaction here, and a Scorpion Sting, even with the 50% cooldown increase, is like perfectly fine, but they keep seeming to want to nerf it even more and more, and it's a little alarming in my opinion, because it's like a good perk, but it's not Roadhog, right? Like if you think of Roadhog from Overwatch, like at a certain point, like Roadhog, every time you hooked you died. Scorpion Sting, I think every time you quote unquote hook someone or you hit someone with it, like they die like maybe a fifth of the time. Like it's not very very common. If you use it at the right time, even then they can iframe it, they can block it. If they have the unmoved artifact now, they won't get affected by it. So there's like, if they have grit, they won't get affected by it. So there's like a lot of conditions for that to actually work, and I think that's kind of overhyped, and people were a little bit I want to say like stupid to play against it, but like you just like there was counters to it that people weren't taking into consideration, and they're like, no, nerf the artifact, don't let me change my gameplay. And it's like, no, that's like a thing where you should probably be changing your gameplay to play around the artifact, in my opinion. Like I don't think the artifact was that OP originally, but it was definitely strong, and now it's like not very usable, and it's a little upsetting because a lot of people are running Spear and Wars, but they're not using this artifact, which is supposed to be like the highlight of like the recent expansions, if that makes sense. The Knee Guards artifact goes from 33% on the physical side to 20% against all range damage. We originally, when we made a video about this, we talked about it at 10%. We're like, at 10%, this is completely useless. At 20%, this is useful for light players, which is good to know. So if you're a featherweight enjoyer, this might be a better option for you if you're mostly warding against range attacks. That being said, we're in a very heavy melee kind of dive disruptor oriented meta, and in that circumstance, we're trying to ward against range and we're trying to ward against melee. Featherweight will still be better, unfortunately. Moving on to gems here. There's a lot of interesting changes for gems. The thing to note is Onyx. This works if your target has high HP. I am sorry for writing. I know people don't like it a lot. Emerald, the way that this works is it's low HP, and then also works if you or your allies are below 50% HP gives you a heal bonus. So the thing that this emerald is like kind of nice for, particularly is like maybe a VG if you're offhand healing, or if you are running a flail. Like this is kind of nice because you're not consistently full HP, so the diamond's not going to proc. So that's like an effect that you will get more value out of for those classes. Onyx is just like generally going to be, I think, dealing the most damage out of anything because a lot of people within game modes are near or at full HP. So you will just effectively get this like damage increase. The problem I see for Onyx is you can get people low, but you can't get that bonus when you're finishing them off, right? So it's like kind of a thing where you'll do more damage with Onyx, but you won't necessarily secure more kills with Onyx. And because you're not necessarily securing more kills, I think it's going to have less value than some of the other effects. Now, Moonstone is kind of interesting because if you don't have any abilities on cooldown, you just do 11 to 20% more damage. No one I don't think anyone's done this yet, but it would be really, really funny to see someone like run one ability and then just do all passives or something like that. Like just go crazy with the passives on some class like Blunderbuss or Musket and just see how much damage they do with the Moonstone. I would not be surprised if that's like super, super sleeper and actually turns out to be like kind of broken. But I don't think a lot of people are going to be going for that kind of route. And in general, Moonstone is going to remain niche and not be used a lot. Jasper is in particular interesting, but the problem with this is it's an empower effect, not a base damage effect. So for a lot of players, this is just not like good looking because you're already at the empower cap of 50% or you're decently above that empower cap to kind of mitigate some of that weakens or some of those weakens. If you have Rune Glass, this is going to be 6% per, and if you have an actual just Jasper Gem, this is going to be 8% per. I believe the tooltip was kind of misleading, but you could see that from the data mine kind of things. So Jasper is in a good spot. Like this is very very viable, but I don't think it's going to be used by everyone. I still think people are probably going to use this Opal, even though it's going to be at 9% with an actual Rune Glass in there. But if you don't have a Rune Glass, it's going to be 12%, which is nice. There is a debate, I think, at a certain point between going with the Rune Glass or not a Rune Glass, and I think you can kind of go either way. But end of the day, Opal is the most consistent to proc, so it's probably going to be the one that's used. I would not also be surprised if Malachite's used a little bit more because the IG seems like it's going to be really, really good this patch. Malachite will consistently proc, and that will just, in general, just do more damage. In terms of Carnelian, this is just kind of like PvE related new functionality that increases damage by 2% to taunted foes per gem slotted. I don't think this is like super, super impactful, but it's like, it's a little bit impactful from a PvE perspective. There might be something here I'm missing, but I don't think I am really. The Sapphire, this is focus, so you could have focus that does arcane damage, or you can do like amber nature damage is what I'm thinking of. So you have the option there if you want to go one way or the other. I don't believe you can slot either of these gems into like a flail, a VG, or a life staff, if that makes sense. So I can't make my flail, which is naturally going to be doing more arcane damage, go to have nature damage scaling. Like that's not a thing. So there is like somewhat of a balance there to note. And you'd also just get a flat up damage like boost if you were to do that because flail scales at 60% focus right now. And if you were to put that gem in, then it would be 65% focus. So there's like weird stuff like that that you don't have the ability to play with. But in general, these gems are going to be used mostly for offhands, I think, or if you're just trying to convert your main weapon to have a different damage type. So if you're a bow, if you're a musket, you tend to slot one of these like gems to kind of mitigate or get around people that ward super heavily to thrust because bow and musket tend to hit harder, so people like try to ward versus them more. Same thing with like fire related classes, people tend to ward to fire very hard, so you tend to like want to switch your gem setup to try to do more damage with something that's not mitigated. The key thing here is you're going to be scaling at 75% of your int, right? So if you're a fire staff and you're doing 100% int scaling, you're going to be taking a 25% a scaling like hit to be going around that protection for 50% of your damage. So is that worth it usually? No. You're just mostly going to be using these for offhands now. It's not going to be something that's going to be used a lot for a conversion standpoint to try to increase your damage for a certain class. So that's kind of nice. Flail had some kind of more minor bug fixes that got changed. The main big one here is that Vortex is actually applying a haste to yourself now, which it wasn't doing before. There are some like other changes here, but I don't think they're like as gameplay influential as like just getting your haste all the time, which wasn't working before, which is a little bit frustrating. So now you'll be able to run a little bit faster as Hail. We went from having super speed to not having any speed, and now we're going to be in a medium moment, which is nice. Uh, Hatchet, they made it a little bit less awkward to use. Ice Gauntlet, uh, they just made it so that the tooltips were like correctly displayed. The Ice Pound and Tomb appear to be like remain generally unchanged. Just kind of visual clutter here. Musket, uh, they fixed some bugs that allowed it to kind of play more fluid, as well as made it so that you can't switch between different stances. This second change here was already kind of done before. I don't know why they brought this up again. That was already a thing. Life staff, though, this is like kind of the key one of the video, I think. If you life staff is not going to be boosting your consumes or lifesteal healing, which means that you don't want to actually run into a sacred anymore to pop your pot. You just want to pop your pot. Pots in general are getting buffed this patch because of this change. I don't think they really mentioned that here, but pots are getting a 25% buff to how much they're actually healing because of this change. So you're going to be a little bit more self-sustaining. That somehow did not make it into the patch notes, but was mentioned in the dev video at one point. And because of that, you're going to be a little bit less healer dependent. You don't necessarily have to play on those sacreds, which is nice. That being said, life staff is still going to be healing you for a lot. It's also noteworthy that the consume buffs, like those permanent buffs that you have, that people are like, oh, you need to pop like this random trade skill food that actually didn't count as a consume buff under the hood, but I don't tell the people that have been doing that for 4 months that they've been paying me to like get those buffs / I was taking advantage of on the trade posts. That's not gonna be a thing anymore, and it's only gonna apply to like temporary buffs. Basically, is like what's happening here. So life staff is like effectively getting nerfs from this. They're not gonna be healing for as much, hopefully, but they'll still be healing for a lot. I saw like a VOD yesterday where someone was healed for over 10k with a single target from life staff, and that doesn't make any sense in my opinion. It's just like such a ridiculous amount of healing that comes from one weapon. It just like it's kind of painful to watch. Void Gauntlet, they fixed an issue that caused the lifesteal from Essence Rupture to not trigger at every hit. I hope Essence Rupture gets good at one point. It's certainly like something I run a lot in PvE to kind of make it easier to run certain mutations, but from a PvP perspective, I've never really been that good. It's something that's cleansable, so it's like always kind of not been fantastic in wars. But it's like a very interesting skill and it'd be kind of cool to see it like have some time in the light. Great Axe, this one is really interesting where they talk about up or updating an ability to be from 30% damage increase when three targets are nearby to 15% per at a max of 5. So you're going from 30 to 75. The thing with this that a lot of people don't realize this is what a whirlwind. They're talking about whirlwind here, and the problem with whirlwind inherently is that I'm not looking at whirlwind. I'm looking. It's surrounded as a passive. The problem with whirlwind inherently is it's scaling at 50% weapon damage, which means that this is not actually like a giant buff. Because if you're doing 50% of your weapon damage and you're making that like, what, just a little bit stronger, it's just like not gonna be like that good overall. Like you're going from 0.5 times 1.3 to 0.5 times 1.75, which is like roughly a difference of 35% when I calculated that earlier. So it's like a decent buff, like a 35% buff to Whirlwind, but Whirlwind's still not hitting as hard as an auto attack. Like, you have to realize that Whirlwind's just been using the escape ability for a reason, and the main culprit for this is from a damage formula side. It's like because it's doing 50% of your weapon damage, versus look at Maelstrom, it's doing 110% of your weapon damage. This is actually boosting your damage compared to an auto, but it's not the case with Whirlwind. Charge is doing an increased amount of damage. Execute's doing a way more damage. Like other effects are just in general dealing more damage than your basic auto attacks, but that's not the case for Whirlwind itself, and it's the reason why it's kind of lacked for a while. Whirlwind, you will be able to get to like that empower and base damage cap now, which is kind of interesting if you're on the actual perk for it. So I think there's potential to try to make a Beyblade thing work, but I think it's unlikely for it to be like super influential. So that's noteworthy. Also, this is like kind of a big change from an economy standpoint. Azoth cap is increased, which is just like quality of life for like crafting like Asmodium and stuff like that. But at the gypsum kill now, you're going to be able to spend 20 gypsum orbs and get 1.5k gold and 250 dark matter, and you can do that once per week. So that's super nice for anyone that's like kind of gearing up a character, wants to get like an artifact unlocked. You're gonna have to wait for 2 weeks if you're gonna go for this method, but it's just like a good way to use those gypsum orbs other than just using them for what do you call them, the weapon casts, the jewelry casts, the armor casts. Like those are a good way to use them as well, but this is the other way that you could use them now. So multiple avenues there. I believe if you actually use them to craft stuff, you're going to get more gold out of them, but you're not going to get this dark matter bonus. So you have an option there to kind of alleviate some of the suffering that some of the latest patch stuff has done to the economy. I don't know if it's going to be enough, but it's certainly interesting nonetheless. They fixed timeless shards, so they could drop from one boss per expedition, so it's not like multiple. It's going to be a little bit less of that. The prices go up a bit, but I don't think it's super influential. The other interesting thing here is they're updating Outpost Rush to have better rewards, and like in terms of platinum, let me find it. Platinum ore is going to be having an increase in value, same with gold and silver, because you're going to be able to craft gems with this. So gem prices should go down, which lets you to kind of use your gear for different things. Rune glass is still going to be expensive because no one wants to go to Brim to farm the globs, really, and farm the runes. But gems themselves will be cheaper. You should be able to play with more sets because of that. It's like kind of a nice change there. Let me know what you guys think of these changes, but from what I'm reading so far, and like what I know about this patch and like playing on now EU and NA, in terms of like wars and like OPR and all that good stuff, doing M2, I don't really do M3s that much. Is like this patch is in general gonna have big changes to how clump fights work. Like people are gonna be taking more damage in clump fights. Heavy players are getting a buff because they're gonna most likely gonna be running the ice gauntlet on a lot of weapons. So like any mage player is getting a pretty significant buff, but in terms of like a melee perspective or like a range perspective, you're generally getting nerfs for this patch, or just not gonna feel as good because you can't do that like T2 fire gem and your blunderbuss to do even more damage kind of thing. Like that's not gonna work anymore. There's like some interactions there that are just not going to be benefiting you from these latest changes, and in general it's going to be easier to ward to matchups that have more damage. So if you're worried about thrust damage and fire damage, you could just straight up ward to thrust and fire this next patch and you won't take as much damage. There's an argument that like there's things like the lightning bow that we'll be able to get around that, but from what I've seen with the lightning bow, and what I've heard from the devs, where if it only works so that you have to hit one target, a single target 3 times for that damage bonus to apply, I don't think that lightning bow is going to be nearly as good as people are hyping it up to be. I think people are like, oh my god, this is insane. I think it's going to be okay. It's going to be viable, but I don't think it's going to be meta by any means. Like if you have like maybe if you have 3 bow players, maybe one of these runs the lightning bow. Maybe. If you have like 5, maybe it's 2. But like it's not like a hey, just go lightning bow, this is better kind of thing. Like I imagine OPR will just be filled with lightning bows, but from what I'm seeing on paper, the lightning bow doesn't seem good because it's an effect that most likely will be sticking to a target. If it sticks to a target, it can be cleansed. If it does not stick to a target and it just stays on your character as an active buff, and then I think it will have the potential to be good. But from how the devs were saying it, I don't understand how they can implement it. So you have to hit the same target 3 times in a row for this to pop, unless it stays on the character that you're attacking. Because if it stays on your friendly character, then it can hit a different target, and you should be able to have an increase to your counter there before it pops, and that doesn't really make as much sense to me. But let me know what you guys think. It's going to be an interesting patch for sure. Definitely not as revolutionary as the previous season, obviously, because it's not an expansion. But there are a lot of quality of life things here, and I think it will kind of hold a new world over into January, where hopefully we get back on track to seeing like more interesting things, maybe some other interactions besides like a new dungeon and some new artifacts, and we get to like more kind of game-changing related updates rather than additional things to farm. Like in terms of dungeons right now, like we have like 7 or 8 of those at this point, or something kind of like large like that. I haven't counted exactly, but if you're just adding one dungeon to that, it's not really increasing the amount of content. It's just, to me, it's just decreasing the chance to be able to farm an artifact I don't want to farm that week, which is kind of frustrating. But it is what it is, and that is a form of content the devs can add that's horizontal, and they have been choosing to do that over and over. So it will be interesting to see what happens next, but until then, I'll see you guys later.